I knew my spinster great-aunt Philomena as a formidable, gray-haired old lady. She lived in a somewhat neglected mock-Gothic high-ceilinged Victorian house in Ealing, near the Common. The elaborate geometric tile floor in the porch continued down the passageway, and in defiance of the Clean Air Acts, she always had a coal fire or two burning in the Victorian fireplaces, even sometimes in a bedroom, right through the winter. Her furniture was elaborate and heavy, but threadbare and marked. I'd visited with parents many times, and had stayed there with her on high days and holidays. She had some beautiful paintings in her house, all 6 of them mounted in exquisite ornate gilded gesso-covered frames. Each one of them depicted the same subject, but in a different setting, and I could never choose a favorite as I loved them all. They were disturbingly erotic, and all the more so because each depicted a girl, just embarking on puberty, but otherwise androgynous in shape, and naked. I could see the similarities with myself when I was that age, although perhaps the figures were slightly idealized. What man couldn't become obsessed with the subject? What man could not be gripped with lust at the sight? What man would not therefore feel transformed into a pedophile just from that? They were bad enough in that the subtle erotic nature of each had an effect on me, and I am a mature married woman with children. As a result, to be frank, I was afraid of the effect they would have on my husband, because they were going to be mine, left to me in great-aunt Philomena's will, now that she'd passed away. I was both slightly worried by the effect they would have on him, because great-aunt Philomena normally had them covered when there was a man in the house, but I was also excited that perhaps, just perhaps, I would get the benefits of his sexual arousal. The house and her other possessions had gone to my other relatives, parceled out carefully according to the recipient's interests, tastes, and needs. My brother Richard, for instance, was the new owner of a collection of leather-bound first edition books by a variety of authors, each signed and dedicated. It was the perfect gift for such a bookworm librarian. The bequest to my cousin Petronella, who designs lingerie, was a collection of ladies' intimates from the 19th and early 20th century, a collection that could, and eventually would, do credit to a fashion museum, but all sized for a girl at puberty and not for an adult woman. I thought back to one of the many conversations I'd had with the old lady, in which she told me how the pictures came to be painted. My mother had been in service, you know, Rachel, she had said. I was packed off to her former employer, Lady Leonora Bagshaw. I was sent by train, always a steam train, and they are romantic too in their own way, aren't they? I had nodded, but she was in full flow. I always got picked up in a pony and trapped by her gardener, old Treveneth, and he would hardly grunt more than a word on the way. The pony usually farted a lot. She tittered at the recollection. Anyway, I knew what would happen when I got there. She'd told me several times before, but it was always told a different way, and I loved to hear it. Old Lady Leonora, she was a famous artist, much in demand as a book illustrator. I remember reading books she'd illustrated, children's classics mostly. Boys and girls, mainly girls, getting into adventures. Ha! Just how many girls got tied up in them, and so did I as a model. And often they showed their knickers. But she drew and painted for her own amusement as well. She often drew in pen and ink, but was an expert in watercolors and oils. They didn't have modern paints then, you know, or such a range of colors. I was waiting for great-aunt to tell me what lay in store for her in that house. I was going to be stripped off and measured up. Then her seamstress would alter all the clothes that had been made for me. I loved feeling the fabrics, lace, satin, silk, little ribbons and bows. I loved the fabulous underwear. Sometimes I wore silk caminkers, you know, the one-pieces, you call them teddies now, don't you? Oh, it was so convenient with the button-up crotch under a dress. All of a sudden, I had smooth silk stockings to wear. The first nylons came out then, and I wore those too. Then, Great Aunt Philomena would list all the dresses, frocks, skirts, blouses she wore, and in graphic detail the undies, and what they felt like on her skin. She'd always finish along the lines of, "Oh, how I love those clothes." I felt like a rich girl, instead of the scruffy child I was at home. Of course, I knew I couldn't take anything home with me to wear it. My school friends would taunt me, mock me, in that grubby northern industrial town where I lived. Everything was gray there. She'd inevitably lament the poverty of her childhood, and how nasty her school friends could be if she displayed any eccentricities, so she could never tell them where she'd been or what she'd done, or particularly what she'd worn. I knew that she would then describe the purpose of all the dressing up. Lady Leonora would draw or paint me for her book illustrations. And then, when that was done, we would go down into the gardens or the lonely private cove, or into the bathroom or my bedroom. Then I would undress completely, and then she'd paint me. She always tended to give me the hint of breasts instead of my flat chest, and pin-can my nipples, and almost always paint me from the front. She'd always ignore what my genitals looked like. "You're not embarrassed by that, are you, Rachel?" And then she'd draw me with one of those divine, pert, hairless little slit eyes. At that point, I'd always correct her. "Vulva, Aunty, vulva." She would always look shocked, and say, "But that's such an ugly word, isn't it, dear?" and carry on to walk me round the portraits, and describe each one. Apart from the fact that there were only 6, she treated each as if it was an icon or other religious work to be worshipped in turn. "Just take this one, Rachel darling." I'd been in a blue silk party dress all morning, with silk knickers underneath, but after lunch we walked down to the cove, and I stood naked in the sea for hours. She stressed the length of time it had taken. The sea was flat calm, so it looked like a mill pond. Next on the circuit was the one that wasn't full frontal, showing her bare, boyish bottom set near a small pond in the woods, looking as if the figure was contemplating wandering in, but had stopped, bent over, and was perhaps testing the water or picking a flower, with her feminine cleft all too obviously exposed. Then there was the other painting from behind. In that one, the girl lay on her stomach on a bed reading one of several books. I couldn't see what the one she was reading was, but the others were classic boys' books, Treasure Island, Rob Roy, and Ivanhoe. There could be a secret message in that, but for the fact that the subject had one leg bent at the hip, and her genitals clearly showed that she was a girl, notwithstanding the aptly boyish buttocks. The fourth was perhaps the most explicit of the lot, where the pubescent ballerina practiced at the bare, naked but for ballet shoes and rather revealingly posed. "I fell over 3 times, she said. "Of course, I never really looked like that," she'd say, just something like, "But I wanted to." Oh, how I wanted to look like she painted me. To be perfectly honest, those bottoms bothered me. They bothered me as well when they were taken in conjunction with the last 2. In those, the subject was intended to depict a girl with her first period. In one, she lay back on the bed, legs apart with a trickle of blood spreading into a stain on the sheet, but she was asleep, with a pained expression on her face. In the other, the subject, the young Philomena, as she said, stood with one leg up on the side of an old-fashioned freestanding bath, already filled and foaming, and the subject was examining herself, catching the blood in a linen handkerchief. When I first saw them, I didn't understand, but after my first few periods, I did, and sympathized with poor young Philomena. I found the whole business hard enough to come to terms with. And I got more bothered when I got to know the paintings better, as in the first, a carefully posed hand, and in the second, the corner of the handkerchief was strategically placed, and the paintings were ambiguous. They might as well be depicting a recently castrated boy with his penis concealed. That gave me shivers, as by then I was having regular sex, and I knew that my husband-to-be valued his testicles, and so did I. I asked my parents why, if Lady Leonora was so prolific, that there were only the 6 whales left. My mother knew something of the answer. It all happened at the start of the Second World War. The army requisitioned the manor house for coastal defense, and Leonora moved into a small house in the grounds. It was crammed from floor to ceiling with sketchbooks and framed and unframed artworks. Some officer burnt the main house down, smoking and drinking in bed, and eventually, the ruins were bulldozed. It's a caravan site now. Anyway, Lady L was distraught, had a stroke, and that was the end of it. Some of the artworks were too raunchy for the tastes of the age, and they were burnt. There was a big scandal that had to be hushed up, of course, something that was thought to be perverted and nasty. Great Aunt Philomena showed up, and all she could rescue was a suitcase full of dressing-up underwear that she just left to Petronella, and those 6 canvases. She was working in a publisher in London, and that's where she acquired the books she left to Richard. It was wartime, and she struggled to get down to Cornwall to save what she did. I always wondered, of course, I replied, now that you tell me of the scandal, it all drops into place. Great Aunt Philomena was a boy, the old girl feminized him with the clothes, and painting him as a girl, and he went on to be a tranny. Those 2 shown him after he was gelded. It's plain, isn't it? Oh no, Rachel, said my mother, the transsexual was Lady Leonora. They couldn't do the operation then, so I suppose you could call her just a crossdresser. No one guessed, and poor old Philomena was traumatized to find out. So much so that she never admitted the truth. The family thought that they had been putting their daughter in the hands of a pervert, and that was nub of the scandal. But Lady Leonora was living out her dearest wish with Philomena, to have been born a girl, and she did it through her art. By the time you were a regular visitor, Philomena loved you, you know, as you were like the girl in the paintings. When you were younger, she was going a bit gaga, and sometimes she even mistook you for her younger self. At the end, she thought you were the subject of the paintings, and that she had painted them herself.